The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Jake Morrison guided his weathered horse toward the general store. The town felt different today, too quiet, with an undercurrent of tension that made his hand instinctively drift toward the Colt .45 at his hip. After 3 years of monthly supply runs, Jake had developed a sixth sense for trouble, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The first sign came from Old Pete sweeping the boardwalk outside the saloon. Instead of his usual friendly wave, Pete's eyes darted nervously toward the Grand Hotel before he quickly disappeared inside. Jake's jaw tightened. In a town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, sudden silence meant only one thing: violence. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden planks as he approached the hotel. Through the grimy windows, he could see a crowd gathered in the lobby, their voices a low murmur of excitement and fear. He pushed through the batwing doors and immediately understood why the town had gone quiet. A man lay sprawled across the Persian rug in the center of the lobby, blood pooling beneath his head from what appeared to be a bullet wound to the temple. Jake recognized him immediately. Cornelius Hartwell, the merchant who'd been bragging for weeks about his mail-order bride arriving from Boston. The man's expensive suit was torn, his face frozen in an expression of shock and rage. Standing over the body, still as a statue, was the most striking woman Jake had ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pinned in an elaborate style that spoke of Eastern refinement. Her emerald traveling dress, though now splattered with blood, was clearly expensive. But it was her eyes that captured Jake's attention, deep green and filled with a mixture of terror and fierce determination that reminded him painfully of his late wife, Sarah. In her final moments, in her trembling hand, she clutched a small derringer, smoke still wisping from its barrel. "Put the gun down, Miss," Sheriff Hawkins commanded, his own weapon drawn but wavering slightly. The lawman was clearly out of his depths. Cedar Ridge rarely saw anything more violent than Saturday night brawls. Nice and easy now. The woman who had to be Eleanor Whitmore, the bride Hartwell had been expecting, didn't move. Her knuckles were white around the derringer's pearl handle, and Jake could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath the fitted bodice of her dress. He tried to, she began, her voice carrying the cultured accent of Boston's upper class, but the words died in her throat. "She murdered Cornelius in cold blood," shouted Mrs. Pemberton, the hotel owner's wife, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "Shot him down like a dog when he was just trying to welcome his bride." "That's not what happened," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now but still shaking. "He said I had to earn my keep before the wedding. When I refused, he grabbed me, tore my dress. He said no one would believe a desperate mail-order bride over a respected businessman." Jake studied the scene more carefully. Hartwell's pants were unbuttoned, his shirt disheveled. Eleanor's dress was indeed torn at the shoulder, revealing angry red marks on her pale skin. The derringer was a lady's weapon, small enough to hide in a reticule knot, the kind of gun someone would choose for premeditated murder. "Don't matter what he did," growled Tom Bradley, one of Hartwell's business associates. "Can't have women shooting men in broad daylight. Sets a bad precedent." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Jake saw the ugly mood beginning to form. In frontier towns, justice was often swift and brutal, especially when it came to outsiders. Eleanor Whitmore was about as outside as they came a refined Eastern woman who'd just killed one of the town's wealthiest citizens. String her up, someone called from the back of the crowd. Save the territory, the cost of a trial. Eleanor's face went white, but she raised the derringer with both hands, pointing it at the advancing crowd. Stay back, she warned, though Jake could see her hands shaking violently. I won't let you murder me for defending myself. Sheriff Hawkins looked helplessly between the crowd and the woman, clearly hoping someone else would take charge of the situation. Jake had seen that look before, the moment when a weak man realizes he's in over his head and starts looking for an escape. That's when Jake made a decision that would change everything. Eleanor, he called out, stepping forward through the crowd. Every eye turned to him, including those striking green ones. Eleanor Morrison, what the hell are you doing here? The confusion on her face was genuine, but Jake pressed on before anyone could question his claim. I told you to wait at the ranch, he continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Didn't I tell you that Hartwell was trouble? That's why I hired you as my housekeeper instead of letting you go through with this fool marriage. Eleanor's eyes widened as she understood what he was offering: a lifeline, a story that might save her from the noose. She was clearly intelligent. Jake could see her mind racing as she processed the implications. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, she said carefully, lowering the derringer slightly. But when Mr. Hartwell sent word that he wanted to see me to discuss the cancelled arrangement, I thought it would be safe to meet him here. I never imagined he would try to force himself on my employee, Jake finished grimly, stepping closer to Hartwell's body. Looks like Cornelius finally pushed the wrong woman too far. Sheriff Hawkins frowned. Jake, I didn't know you'd hired a housekeeper. When did? Last week, Jake lied smoothly. Posted a notice in the Denver papers. Miss Whitmore here answered it. Decided she'd rather work for honest wages than marry a stranger. Smart woman. The crowd was murmuring now, uncertain. Jake Morrison was respected in Cedar Regia, war veteran who kept to himself and never caused trouble. If he vouched for the woman, that's a lie. Mrs. Pemberton shrieked. She came here to marry Cornelius. I saw the letters. Letters arranging a meeting to discuss her change of plans, Jake said calmly. Eleanor, show them the employment contract. For a moment, Jake thought he'd overplayed his hand. Eleanor stared at him blankly, and he could see her mind working furiously. Then, to his amazement, she reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded paper. Here, she said, handing it to Sheriff Hawkins. Though I hardly think Mr. Morrison's private business arrangements are anyone else's concern. Jake managed to keep his expression neutral as Hawkins unfolded what appeared to be a genuine employment contract. Where the hell had she gotten that? Unless... This looks official, Hawkins admitted grudgingly. But that doesn't change the fact that she killed a man. In self-defense, Jake said firmly, Look at her dress, Sheriff. Look at the marks on her arms. Cornelius tried to rape her, and she defended herself. That's not murder, that's justice. The crowd was wavering now, but Jake could see Tom Bradley working to stir them up again. The man had his own reasons for wanting Eleanor silenced. Probably knew about some of Hartwell's shadier business dealings. We need to get out of here, Jake murmured to Eleanor as the crowd's attention focused on Bradley's inflammatory speech. Now, while they're distracted, Eleanor nodded, slipping the derringer into her reticule. My bag is upstairs. Leave it. We'll send for it later. They edged toward the door, but Bradley's voice rose above the murmur. Don't let them leave. She's a murderer, and he's helping her escape. The crowd surged forward, and Jake's hand flew to his gun. But Eleanor was fast as she grabbed a kerosene lamp from a nearby table and hurled it at the floor between them and their pursuers. Glass shattered, and flames spread across the alcohol-soaked rug, creating a barrier of fire. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Eleanor's hand and pulling her toward the door as the crowd scrambled back from the flames. They burst onto the street to find more townspeople gathering, drawn by the commotion. Jake's horse was still tied at the hitching post, but one horse couldn't carry them both fast enough to escape a mounted posse. "Can you ride?" he asked Eleanor as they ran toward his mount. "I've never been on a horse in my life," she gasped, her skirts hampering her movement. Jake cursed under his breath as he untied the reins. Behind them, he could hear Sheriff Hawkins organizing a pursuit. They had minutes, maybe less, before the whole town would be after them. "Hold on tight," he said, swinging into the saddle and pulling Eleanor up behind him. "And whatever you do, don't let go." As his horse leaped forward, Jake felt Eleanor's arms wrap around his waist with desperate strength. Behind them, angry shouts filled the air, and he knew their real troubles were just beginning. The ride to Jake's ranch had been a nightmare of bouncing terrain and Eleanor's terrified grip around his waist, but they'd managed to stay ahead of the hastily organized posse. Now, 3 days later, Jake was beginning to wonder if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Eleanor Whitmore was nothing like what he'd expected from a mail-order bride. She moved through his modest ranch house like a caged wildcat, her refined mannerisms clashing violently with the rough-hewn furniture and practical necessities of frontier life. She'd burned breakfast to morning's running, nearly poisoned them both with improperly prepared beans, and seemed genuinely baffled by the concept of drawing water from a well. But it was the little things that made Jake suspicious. The way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon as if expecting pursuit, how she flinched whenever he moved too quickly, and most puzzling of all, the employment contract she'd produced at the hotel. Jake had examined it closely and found it to be a masterwork of forgery, complete with aged paper and convincing legal language. This morning, he'd caught her in his study, carefully examining the wanted posters he kept in his desk drawer, part of his unofficial arrangement with the territorial marshal to keep an eye out for dangerous fugitives. When he'd entered the room, she'd spun around with guilty speed, but not before he'd seen her slip something into the folds of her skirt. "Looking for something?" Jake asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Eleanor's cheeks flushed pink, but her chin lifted with that stubborn pride he was beginning to recognize. "I was merely curious about your reading material. You have quite an impressive collection of books for a..." She paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to phrase her thoughts. "For a rough cowboy." Jake supplied with a dry smile. "My late wife Sarah was a schoolteacher. She insisted on educating me properly." The mention of his wife seemed to soften Eleanor's defensive posture slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss. She must have been a remarkable woman to accomplish such a transformation." Jake moved to his desk and casually opened the drawer where he kept the wanted posters. As he'd suspected, several were missing. "She taught me to read people as well as books. For instance, I can tell when someone's been going through my private papers." Eleanor's face went pale, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she reached into her skirt and pulled out 3 wanted posters, placing them carefully on his desk. "I was merely checking to see if my description had been updated." Jake examined the posters and felt his blood run cold. Each one had been subtly altered hair color, changed from auburn to black, height increased by several inches, distinguishing marks added or removed. The work was so skillful that he might not have noticed if he hadn't memorized the original descriptions. Eleanor Whitmore, he read from the top poster. Wanted for the murder of Marcus Whitmore in Boston, Massachusetts. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. He looked up at her with new eyes. Your stepfather, I'm guessing. She nodded, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. He was not a good man. He married my mother for her inheritance and spent it all on gambling and drink. When she died, he decided I should earn back what he'd lost by entertaining his business associates. Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception. So you killed him. I defended myself, Eleanor said firmly, just like with Hartwell. But Marcus had friends in the Boston police, men who owed him money or favors. They made sure the official story painted me as a cold-blooded killer who murdered her stepfather for his inheritance. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Jake moved quickly to the window and cursed under his breath. 3 riders were approaching the ranch, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothes dusty from hard travel. Bounty hunters, by the look of them, the kind of men who asked questions with bullets and collected their fees from corpses. Get in the root cellar, Jake ordered. But Eleanor was already moving, gathering her skirts and heading for the kitchen where the cellar entrance was hidden beneath a heavy rug. Wait, she said, turning back to him. If they search the house, they won't find you, Jake promised. But she shook her head. That's not what I meant. I need you to know I can be more than just a burden. If you're willing to trust me. Before Jake could ask what she meant, the sound of boots on his front porch announced the arrival of their visitors. Eleanor disappeared into the cellar just as a heavy fist pounded on his door. Jake opened it to find 3 hard-faced men, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. The leader was a tall, scarred man with cold blue eyes and the kind of smile that never reached above his mouth. Afternoon, the man said. Name's Cutter. We're looking for a dangerous fugitive woman named Eleanor Whitmore. Word is she might have passed through these parts. Can't say I've seen any strange women, Jake replied easily. What's she wanted for? Murder, Cutter said, his eyes scanning the interior of the house behind Jake. Killed her own stepfather in cold blood, then shot down a businessman in Cedar Ridge a few days back. There's a substantial reward for her capture. How substantial? Jake asked, playing the part of a man whose interest had been piqued by the mention of money. $500. Dead or alive? Jake whistled low. That's serious money. You boys want to come in, have some coffee while you tell me more about this woman. I might have seen something after all. Cutter's smile widened, and he gestured for his companions to follow him inside. Jake led them to his kitchen table, noting how their eyes catalogued every detail of his home. Professional hunters, definitely the kind who'd killed more than their share of fugitives. Coffee's fresh, Jake said, pouring 3 cups from the pot on his stove. Now, what's this woman look like? As Cutter described Eleanor using the original, unaltered description from the wanted poster, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. These men knew exactly who they were looking for, which meant someone had given them accurate information. Sounds like a real dangerous character, Jake said, settling into his chair. What makes you think she came this way? Sheriff in Cedar Ridge said she rode out with a local rancher, Cutter explained. Man named Morrison. You wouldn't happen to know him, would you? Jake's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his gun. Can't say I do. This is a big territory, lots of ranchers around. One of Cutter's companions, a nervous man with twitchy eyes, suddenly pointed toward the stove. "Boss, look at that coffee pot. It's got 4 cups set out, but there's only 3 of us and him." Jake's heart sank as he realized his mistake. In his haste to appear hospitable, he'd automatically set out the same number of cups he'd been using for the past 3 days. 1 for him, and 1 for Eleanor. Cutter's hand dropped to his gun. "Seems like you might have company after all, Morrison. Why don't you call your lady friend out here so we can all get acquainted?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, but he could see the suspicion in their eyes hardening into certainty. "Search the house," Cutter ordered his men, "and be thorough. That woman's worth $500, and I intend to collect." As the bounty hunters began tearing through his home, Jake caught a glimpse of movement near the cellar entrance. Eleanor was emerging, but something was different about her. Gone was the refined posture and careful speech. Instead, she moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. And when she spoke, her voice carried a completely different accent. Uneducated, with the flat vowels of someone raised in poverty. "Well, howdy there, Cousin Jake," she called out in a voice that was barely recognizable. "Sorry I'm late, getting back from tending the chickens." Who were these fancy gentlemen? Jake stared at her in amazement. Eleanor had somehow transformed herself completely. Her hair was mussed and dirty, her dress rumpled and stained, and she carried herself like a simple farm girl who'd never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. Even her face looked different, as if she'd somehow rearranged her features to appear coarser and less refined. Cutter frowned, clearly confused. This woman bore only a passing resemblance to the refined lady they were hunting. "What's your name, miss?" "Folks call me Ellie," she said with a gap-toothed grin that Jake was certain hadn't been there moments before. "Ellie Morrison. Jake here's my cousin, took me in when my pa died of the fever last winter. You seen any strange women around here lately?" Cutter pressed. Well-dressed lady, probably traveling alone. Eleanor Alice scratched her head and looked genuinely puzzled. "Can't say I have, Mr. Don't get many visitors out here except for the preacher and the supply wagon." "Why, she'll do something bad." Jake watched in fascination as Eleanor played her part perfectly, even going so far as to wipe her nose on her sleeve and spit into the dirt. The transformation was so complete that he found himself wondering if this might actually be the real Eleanor, if the refined lady had been the disguise all along. One of the bounty hunters approached Eleanor and grabbed her chin roughly, turning her face toward the light. "Hair's the wrong color," he muttered, "and she's too short. Plus, look at her hands, these are working hands. Not some fancy ladies." Jake glanced at Eleanor's hands and saw that she was right, they were rough and calloused, stained with what looked like years of hard labor. How was that possible? 3 days ago, her hands had been soft and pale. Satisfied? Jake asked as the bounty hunter released Eleanor. Cutter holstered his gun reluctantly. "For now, but if you see anything suspicious, you send word to the sheriff in Cedar Ridge. That woman's dangerous, and she's got to be hiding somewhere in this territory." After the bounty hunters left, Jake turned to Eleanor with a mixture of admiration and deep unease. "That was incredible. How did you change my appearance so completely?" Eleanor finished, her refined accent returning as she straightened her posture. "It's a useful skill when you've spent 2 years running from the law. But Jake, there's something you need to know about those men. They weren't just bounty hunters." "What do you mean?" Eleanor's face was grim as she pulled a small vial from her pocket, one that Jake recognized as coming from his medicine cabinet. While they were searching the house, I managed to slip a little something into their coffee. Nothing fatal, just enough to make them very sick for the next few days. You see, I recognized the leader. He's not hunting me for the bounty. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Then why? Because Marcus Whitmore wasn't just my stepfather, Eleanor said quietly. He was also a fence for stolen goods, and he kept detailed records of all his transactions. When I killed him, I took those records. Cutter and his friends are some of the criminals named in those ledgers, and they want me dead before I can turn that information over to the authorities. Jake stared at her, realizing that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple case of self-defense. What else aren't you telling me, Eleanor? She met his gaze steadily, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw no deception in her eyes, only a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many secrets carried for too long. Everything, she said simply. I haven't told you everything, but I will if you're willing to listen. Because those men will be back, and when they come, they won't be interested in taking me alive. The storm that had been building on the horizon for 3 days finally broke just after midnight, turning the world outside Jake's ranch house into a howling maelstrom of wind and rain. Eleanor sat by the fireplace, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching Jake pace like a caged wolf. They should have been back by now, he muttered, checking his pocket watch for the 10th time in an hour. Cutter and his men. That poison you gave them should have worn off yesterday. Eleanor nodded grimly. She'd spent the past week telling Jake everything about the ledgers hidden in her carpet bag back at the hotel, about the network of criminals her stepfather had been involved with, and about the federal marshal in Denver who'd been trying to build a case against them for months. What she hadn't told him was that she'd sent a coded message to that marshal 3 days ago, using skills learned from her real father, Union spy during the war who'd taught his daughter more than just proper etiquette. Jake, she began, but the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm's fury. Multiple riders, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. Jake blew out the oil lamps and moved to the window, peering through the rain-lashed glass. 8 men, maybe more. They've got the house surrounded. Eleanor joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead rider. Silas Crenshaw, Jake's neighbor and longtime enemy, sat his horse like a man who'd finally found the leverage he'd been seeking for years. Behind him rode Cutter and his surviving men, along with several of Crenshaw's ranch hands. Morrison. Crenshaw's voice boomed across the yard. I know you're harboring a fugitive. Send out the Whitmore woman, and maybe I won't burn your ranch to the ground. Jake's jaw tightened. Crenshaw's been trying to get his hands on my water rights for 5 years. This gives him the perfect excuse to take what he wants and claim he was just upholding the law. You don't understand, Eleanor said urgently. Crenshaw's name is in my stepfather's ledgers. He's been buying stolen cattle and selling them through Marcus's network. If I testify against him, he loses everything, Jake finished. So this isn't just about the bounty anymore. It's about survival. A rifle shot shattered the window above their heads, sending glass cascading to the floor. You've got 1 minute, Morrison, Crenshaw shouted. Then we come in shooting. Jake grabbed his Winchester from above the mantelpiece and checked the ammunition. How many rounds do you have for that Derringer? 2, Eleanor admitted. But Jake, I won't let you die for me. If I surrender, "They'll kill you the moment you step outside," Jake said flatly. "And then they'll kill me to eliminate any witnesses. We fight or we die together." Another shot rang out, this one aimed at the front door. Eleanor could hear men moving around the house, taking positions. They were trapped, outnumbered 4-1, with nowhere to run. That's when she remembered the root cellar. "Jake, the tunnel," she said suddenly. "When you showed me the cellar, you mentioned your wife had insisted on digging an escape tunnel during the Apache troubles. Does it still connect to the barn?" Jake's eyes lit up with sudden hope. "It does, but the barn's probably watched." "Not if we create a distraction," Eleanor interrupted. She was already moving toward the kitchen, her mind racing through possibilities. "How much black powder do you have for blasting stumps?" "Half a keg," but Jake stopped as he realized what she was planning. "Eleanor, that's suicide." "If you miscalculate the charge, I won't," she said with quiet confidence. "My real father wasn't just a spy, Jake. He was a demolitions expert. He taught me everything he knew before the consumption took him." Outside, Crenshaw was growing impatient. "Time's up, Morrison." "Boys, light it up." The first torch sailed through the broken window, landing on Jake's prized Persian rug, a wedding gift from his late wife. Eleanor watched his face harden as the flames began to spread, consuming one of his last connections to Sarah. "Get to the tunnel," Eleanor ordered, already heading for the cellar. "I'll be right behind you." Jake hesitated, torn between protecting her and trusting her expertise. Another torch crashed through the kitchen window, and the decision was made for him. He grabbed what supplies he could carry and disappeared into the cellar entrance. Eleanor worked quickly, her father's training taking over as she calculated charges and fuse lengths. The black powder was old but still potent, and she had just enough to accomplish what she needed. She set 3 charges, one in the main house to create the primary distraction, one in the chicken coop to simulate an escape attempt, and one in the woodshed to block the most direct route to the barn. As she lit the first fuse, she could hear Crenshaw's men breaking down the front door. She had maybe 2 minutes before they realized the house was empty, and another minute after that before they started searching for alternative exits. The tunnel was cramped and muddy, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Eleanor could hear Jake ahead of her, his breathing labored in the confined space. Behind them, the first explosion rocked the house, followed immediately by shouts of confusion and alarm. They emerged in the barn just as the second charge detonated, sending chickens squawking in all directions. Through the barn's open doors, Eleanor could see several of Crenshaw's men running toward the chicken coop, thinking their quarry was making a break for the open range. "The horses," Jake gasped, pointing toward the stalls. "We can," the third explosion cut him off, and suddenly the barn doors were filled with armed men. Cutter stood in the entrance, his scarred face twisted with rage and his gun already drawn. "Going somewhere," he snarled. "Thought you were real clever with that poison trick, didn't you? Made me sicker than a dog for 3 days. Now I'm going to return the favor." Jake raised his rifle, but Cutter was faster. The bounty hunter's shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a pile of hay bales. Eleanor screamed and rushed to his side, pressing her hands against the bleeding wound. "Touching," Crenshaw said as he entered the barn behind Cutter. "But this little reunion is over. Miss Whitmore, you're coming with us. And Morrison, well, I'm afraid you won't be needing those water rights anymore." Eleanor looked up at the 2 men, her mind racing. Jake was losing blood fast, and they were still outnumbered. But she had one advantage: they didn't know about the message she'd sent to the federal marshal hadn't just been a request for help. It had also included the location of her stepfather's ledgers and detailed instructions for their recovery. Asterisk. "You're too late," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "The ledgers are already in federal hands. Marshal Davidson has everything he needs to destroy your entire operation." Crenshaw's face went white. "You're lying, am I?" Eleanor challenged. "Why do you think it took Cutter so long to find me?" "Because I've been negotiating my surrender in exchange for federal protection. The only reason I'm still here is because I was waiting for confirmation that the evidence had been secured." It was a desperate bluff, but Eleanor could see doubt creeping into Crenshaw's eyes. The man was a criminal, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that federal marshals didn't give up easily, and if Eleanor really had been in contact with them, kill them both, Cutter snarled. "We'll deal with the marshals later." But as he raised his gun, the sound of approaching horses filled the night air. Not the scattered hoofbeats of fleeing ranch hands, but the disciplined thunder of a cavalry unit riding in formation. Eleanor's heart leaped as she recognized the voice that rang out across the ranch yard. "Federal marshals, this property is under federal protection. Lay down your weapons." Crenshaw cursed and grabbed Eleanor by the hair, pressing his gun to her temple. "Seems like your friends arrived just in time to watch you die, sweetheart." But Eleanor was already moving, using a technique her father had taught her years ago. She drove her elbow back into Crenshaw's solar plexus while simultaneously grabbing his gun hand and twisting it away from her head. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the barn's rafters as Crenshaw doubled over. Gasping for breath, Cutter tried to bring his own gun to bear. But Jake, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to tackle the bounty hunter around the legs. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting desperately for control of the weapon. Eleanor grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and advanced on Crenshaw, who was still struggling to breathe. "It's over," she said firmly. "The marshals have your ledgers, your men are surrounded, and your cattle-rustling operation is finished." Crenshaw looked up at her with pure hatred in his eyes. "You think this ends it? There are others, people with more power than you can imagine. They'll never stop hunting you." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted, "but they'll have to go through the federal government to get to me. And somehow, I don't think they're quite that bold." The barn doors burst open as Marshal Davidson and his men poured inside, their weapons drawn and ready. Eleanor had never been so happy to see a badge in her life. "Miss Whitmore," Davidson said with obvious relief, "when we got your message, we came as fast as we could. Are you injured?" "I'm fine," Eleanor replied, then gestured toward Jake. "But he needs a doctor." As the marshal secured Crenshaw and Cutter, Eleanor knelt beside Jake and helped him sit up against the hay bales. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were alert and focused on her. "So," he said with a weak smile, "federal protection, negotiated surrender. Anything else you forgot to mention?" Eleanor felt tears she hadn't realized she was shedding rolled down her cheeks. "Just one thing," she whispered. "I love you, Jake Morrison. And if you die on me now, I'll never forgive you." Jake's smile widened despite his pain. "Well, in that case, I guess I'd better live." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break, and the first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Eleanor looked toward that light and realized that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't running toward an uncertain future. She was running towards something worth fighting for. 3 weeks had passed since the night of fire and federal marshals, and Jake's shoulder was finally healing properly. He sat on his front porch in the early morning light, watching Eleanor tend to the vegetable garden she'd insisted on planting. The woman who'd once burned water was now coaxing tomatoes and beans from the stubborn frontier soil with the same determination she'd shown when facing down armed killers. The ranch bore scars from that terrible night: charred timbers where the house had partially burned, fresh lumber where they'd rebuilt the damaged sections. But like everything else about their life together, it was stronger for having survived the trial by fire. "Jake," Eleanor called from the garden, her voice carrying a note of concern that immediately put him on alert. "We have visitors." He followed her gaze to see a dust cloud approaching from the east, a single rider pushing his horse hard across the prairie. As the figure drew closer, Jake recognized the uniform of a federal marshal, though not Marshal Davidson, who'd become a regular visitor over the past weeks. The marshal who dismounted at their gate was young, barely out of his 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that spoke of urgent news. "Mr. Morrison." "Miss Whitmore." "I'm Marshal Collins. I need to speak with you both immediately." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and joined Jake on the porch, her face carefully composed despite the tension he could see in her shoulders. They'd both learned to be wary of unexpected official visits. "What's this about, Marshal?" Jake asked. Collins glanced around nervously before answering. "There's been a development in the Whitmore case. We've arrested most of the criminal network based on the evidence you provided, Miss Whitmore, but there's a problem. The territorial judge who was supposed to oversee the trials has been murdered." Eleanor's face went pale. "Judge Harrison, shot down in his own chambers 2 nights ago. We think it was Crenshaw's people. He still has allies on the outside, and they're not going to let this case go to trial if they can help it." Jake felt a familiar chill run down his spine. "What does this mean for Eleanor?" "It means the case is being transferred to federal court in Denver," Collins explained. "But until we can guarantee her safety, she needs to disappear again. We've arranged passage on a train to San Francisco, where she'll be given a new identity and federal protection." "No," Eleanor said quietly, but with absolute finality. Collins blinked in surprise. "Miss Whitmore, I don't think you understand the danger." "I understand it perfectly," Eleanor interrupted. "I've been running from danger for 2 years, Marshal. I'm not running anymore." Jake stood and moved to Eleanor's side, his good arm sliding protectively around her waist. "She's not going anywhere." "Mr. Morrison, with respect, this isn't your decision," Collins said, his voice taking on an official tone. "Miss Whitmore is a federal witness in a major criminal case. Her safety is our responsibility." "Her safety is my responsibility," Jake replied firmly. "And she's not leaving this ranch." Collins looked between them with growing frustration. "You don't understand what you're up against. These people have connections throughout the territory. They've already proven they're willing to kill federal judges. What makes you think they'll hesitate to kill a rancher and his, what?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Collins flushed red. "I just meant, well, you're not married, and the arrangement seems irregular." Jake felt Eleanor stiffen beside him, and he knew that the young marshal had just made a serious mistake. Eleanor Whitmore might have learned to love frontier life, but she was still a woman who'd been raised with proper Boston sensibilities. "You're right, Marshal," Jake said suddenly. "The arrangement is irregular. "Eleanor, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal wasn't exactly how Jake had planned it. He'd been working up the courage for weeks, trying to find the perfect moment and the right words. But as Eleanor turned to look at him with tears shining in her green eyes, he realized that sometimes the most important words were the simplest ones. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I will marry you." Collins cleared his throat uncomfortably. That's very romantic, but it doesn't change the situation. Married or not, Miss Whitmore is still in danger." "Mrs. Morrison," Eleanor corrected firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Before Collins could argue further, the sound of approaching horses filled the air again. This time it was multiple riders, and Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he counted at least 6 men approaching at a gallop, expecting company. Collins asked, his own weapon appearing in his hand. "No," Jake replied grimly. "Eleanor, get inside." But Eleanor was already moving, not toward the house but toward the barn where Jake kept his hunting rifles. "How many rounds do we have?" she called over her shoulder. "Enough," Jake replied, though he wasn't sure it was true. 6 men were more than they'd faced before, and this time they didn't have the element of surprise or federal marshals riding to their rescue. The riders pulled up, just outside rifle range, and Jake's heart sank as he recognized the leader. It wasn't one of Crenshaw's men or another bounty hunter, it was Thomas Blackwood, one of the most powerful ranchers in the territory and a man with enough political connections to make federal marshals disappear. "Morrison," Blackwood called out. "I want to talk." "Then talk," Jake shouted back, his rifle trained on the man's chest. "Not from here. Come out where we can discuss this like civilized men." Eleanor had returned from the barn with an armload of weapons, and she pressed a loaded Winchester into Collins's hands. "Don't trust him," she murmured. "Blackwood's name appears in my stepfather's ledgers more than anyone else's. He's been the head of the entire operation." Collins looked shocked. "Thomas Blackwood, but he's one of the most respected men in the territory. He's donated thousands to churches and schools with money stolen from honest ranchers," Eleanor said flatly. "He's been using his reputation as cover for the largest cattle rustling operation in the West." Jake studied the men arrayed against them. They were professionals, well-armed and positioned to cover all the escape routes from the ranch. This wasn't a negotiation, was a siege. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Jake called out. "I want the woman," Blackwood replied. "And the ledgers she stole. Give me both, and you can live." "Counteroffer," Eleanor shouted, stepping into view with her rifle raised. "You and your men ride away now, and maybe I won't tell the federal marshals about the gold mine you've been operating with stolen labor." Even from a distance, Jake could see Blackwood's face darken with rage. The man had clearly expected to intimidate them into submission, not face open defiance. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl," Blackwood snarled. "I own half the politicians in this territory. I can make you disappear without a trace." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted. "But you'll have to explain to those politicians why you murdered a federal marshal in the process." Collins looked surprised to be included in the threat, but he straightened his shoulders and called out, "Thomas Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and cattle rustling. Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial." Blackwood's response was a harsh laugh. "Fair trial, boy. I've been buying judges since before you were born. The only trial here is going to be by fire." He raised his hand, and Jake saw the glint of metal as one of his men prepared to throw something. "Dynamite," he shouted, pushing Eleanor toward the house. The explosion shattered the morning air, sending debris flying in all directions. Jake felt the concussion wave knock him to his knees, his ears ringing from the blast. Through the smoke and dust, he could see Blackwood's men charging toward the house, their guns blazing. Eleanor was already returning fire, her shots precise and deadly. One of the attackers spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Collins, despite his youth and obvious terror, was holding his ground and laying down covering fire. But they were still outnumbered, and Jake could see more riders approaching from the west. Blackwood had brought an army, and they were trapped with nowhere to run. That's when Jake heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the thunder of cavalry hooves and the clear notes of a bugle call. Over the ridge came Marshal Davidson with what looked like half the territorial militia, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Federal marshals. Davidson's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Lay down your weapons." Blackwood's men hesitated, caught between the ranch house and the approaching cavalry. Their leader's face was a mask of fury and desperation as he realized his carefully planned ambush had become a trap. "This isn't over," he screamed at Eleanor. "You think the law will protect you? I am the law in this territory." "Not anymore," Eleanor replied calmly, and Jake heard the click as she cocked her rifle. "You're just another criminal who's about to face justice." Blackwood reached for his gun, but Eleanor was faster. Her shot took him in the chest, and he toppled from his horse to lie still in the dust of Jake's ranch yard. The remaining men threw down their weapons as the federal marshals surrounded them. The battle was over, and for the first time in 2 years, Eleanor Whitmore was truly free. As the dust settled and the marshals began securing the prisoners, Jake pulled Eleanor into his arms, mindful of his healing shoulder. She was shaking with reaction, but her eyes were clear and determined. "So," he said softly, "about that proposal." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to chase away the last shadows of her haunted past. "I believe I said yes, Mr. Morrison, though I should warn why come with quite a bit of baggage." Jake looked around at his battle-scarred ranch, at the federal marshals cleaning up the aftermath of their fight, at the woman in his arms who'd brought danger and chaos and love into his carefully ordered life. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Morrison," he said, and kissed her as the sun climbed higher over their hard-won paradise. 3 months later, they were married in the little church in Cedar Ridge, with Marshal Davidson giving the bride away and half the territorial government in attendance. Eleanor wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Jake wore his best suit with his arm finally free of its sling dots as they exchanged vows. Jake realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters really did lead to the most profound transformations. He'd thought his life was over when Sarah died, but Eleanor had shown him that love could bloom again, stronger and deeper for having been tested by fire, and Eleanor, looking into the eyes of the man who'd risked everything to protect her, knew that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along, not just safety or security, but a true partner who saw her strength and loved her for it. The lonely cowboy and the abandoned mail-order bride had found their happy ending, forged in blood and fire and sealed with a love that would last forever.